do you want to speak to this as
well?
well?
You know, when you're talking about that, I'm thinking about the budget, because I think everything we're talking about comes down to reordering of budget priorities. And the Institute for Policy Studies did a report that came out January 31st of this year that looked at the defense budget versus the climate change prevention budget. And it was an 88-to-1 ratio, 650 billion for defense and about 7.8 billion to climate change, which is, you know, obviously out of kilter when you talk about the kinds of international needs there. And then you can say the same kind of thing when you look at where the World Bank puts its money as far as energy development goes. It's all into the fossil fuel area. It's not much into sustainable. You can see the same thing with the U.S. budget. We're not putting the money into sustainable. We're putting into the fossil fuels still.
And nuclear.
And nuclear. Nuclear is also, that's right, coming up and getting money. So it looks like we're currently going in the wrong direction as far as the kind of paradigm shift that you're both talking about being needed. It's not being reflected in the budget yet. And, you know, I think we could, a lot of people will probably blame the Bush administration for that. And, you know, that's one source of the budget. But literally, you know, the Congress also has a responsibility in this. And they can be raising these issues more effectively than they're not. And so I don't see the paradigm shift happening as quickly as it needs to. I think that's the big roadblock that we face, is how do we get these entrenched interests. I mean, Dwight Eisenhower warned about the military-industrial complex in 1961 in his speech from the Oval Office. And since that time, you know, 50 years later almost, it's gotten a lot stronger. And I don't see any countervailing force that's making a difference. And so I hope that as we just go through this series and get the public educated and energized, we can begin to see some kind of countervailing force to the entrenched interests, the military-industrial complex, the coal and nuclear, the corn lobby. Those are the people who right now are the status quo. Profiting from the status quo is going to be very hard to overcome in our political system.
You know, I wanted to ask if anyone wanted to comment more on the budget. Clearly, the Pentagon is aware that climate change and the security threats it creates is a reason to increase their budget. And I wondered if people had specific comments on what other U.S. institutions or U.S. agencies should be seeking funding to start addressing the climate change issue from hopefully a non-militarized perspective, because now it seems it's a lot in the Pentagon, and you know, who else would we like to see really stepping up on this and asking for funds?
Well, within the government, I guess you'd want to see the Foreign Assistance Organ, right, the USAID or the State Department.
Sure.
You know, that said, I want to qualify that suggestion with a look back at the history of some of the USAID investments in development and the linkage between, if you like, the soft support for international development provided through USAID during the Cold War, which played out in complementary initiatives to counterinsurgency strategies. So clearly I think we'd want to see better balance between state and DoD on that budget request, but that doesn't mean that we think that's the solution. I think along with that would have to be, again, this paradigm shift that you're talking about. Are we, and maybe to get back to Elizabeth's point before, are we investing more in climate adaptation needs because we're afraid of refugees, or is there an equity and justice dimension to this? Are we investing more in it because we acknowledge a historic and clearly an ongoing current responsibility for the kinds of impacts those countries are experiencing right now?
Yeah, directly on the budget, too, I would note that it is a challenge today because of these entrenched interests. And I think historically the United States has always been, you know, very conservative and a very militarized and aggressive country. And that's why, in fact, a lot of the world fears, you know, when the U.S. president speaks, that next thing they'll know there'll be bombs raining down from above somewhere. But the challenge really today, particularly with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, is that the military has now surpassed, you know, well over $500 billion a year in budget. And there's another, probably in the neighborhood of $200 billion for the wars in Iraq, so that brings it up to $700 billion. And we have a cap on discretionary spending of somewhere around $950 billion. So you're left with a few hundred billion, which is obviously a lot of money, but compared to the military budget, you're left with a very small amount to cover all of the domestic needs, let alone international efforts and AID efforts at trying to, you know, produce poverty alleviation and other humanitarian aid projects around the globe. And I think the White House, the current president, future presidents, the Congress really have to address these issues. One of the areas we get involved in, which I think is a good example of what's happening in the challenges, is the U.S. funding of international organizations. And unbeknownst, I think, to most Americans, 47 odd international organizations that the United States provides annual dues and assessments to have been grossly underfunded during the Bush administration for the last several years. And so the group we work with quite a lot is called the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which is the world's largest arms control implementing and inspection regime in The Hague in the Netherlands. The United States, for example, provides about 20% of that annual budget. It has 183 signatory states to its states parties. So our budget there is like $22 million a year. The Bush administration has been requesting about half the amount of funds that's really needed to pay our annual dues there for several years. So the annual dues are not paid for at least a year later. This is the same with the International Atomic Energy Agency. It's the same with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization in Vienna. And that strangles these organizations. And you then cannot really fairly exert the political weight that you should and leadership that you should in addressing all these issues. But you also, in a cash flow issue, strangle these organizations in dealing with any issue multilaterally, like climate change or anything else. So it really is a challenge, I think, here in the United States politically, that you need the political will from the executive branch and also from Congress to raise the tough issues. Do we need another $15 billion a year in missile defense? Do we need to spend $40 billion a year the way we do in nuclear weapons still?
Yeah.
I mean, imagine what $40 billion would do in alleviating poverty or any of the other, eliminating AIDS or malaria or any of the disease prevention programs globally. These are enormous sums of money, and we're just throwing them down a black hole by engaging in this military crisis management that we and military industrial complex support. It's the lobby. It's the pork in the budget.
Right.